Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the disability community.
Awesome. Well, I am a little bit about myself. Um, for starters, my name is Lindsey Mandolini. I use the pronoun she, her. I'm wearing a long sleeve blue sweatshirt. It's Friday, so it's nice to be able to dress a little casual at home. And I have glasses, and my hair is pulled back. I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado, where I live with my wife and our 1-year-old daughter. Um, and your second question was how I get started in the
Yeah, in
disability.
the disability community. Yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up, if I think all the way back, when was like my first experience? And it would be when I grew up with an uncle who had an intellectual and developmental disability. So I think it was, being raised in a family where disability was just a part of our makeup and who we are, and to see how my aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents interacted and advocated for him was really meaningful. And I remember being a little kid and having my uncle say, "Hey, run and grab me a Budweiser, will ya?" And, I'd run around and grab him his Budweiser. And so to see that, disability just wasn't a thing. And if someone else made it a thing, that's where the advocacy really stepped in. My grandma was an advocate in the Catholic Church in Michigan and getting, what we would call like Sunday school, getting that curriculum to be more inclusive to include my uncle. So I would say that's where it started. And then throughout grade school, I was always drawn to, to classes where there would be other kids with disabilities, and I, I, I felt at home. I felt that that was my community, and um, they became dear friends. And so then when I went to college, I thought, how do I get a career where I'm working with folks with disabilities? And that at that point, all that I knew was an option was special education. So I went into teaching, and it was really around that time that I was diagnosed with ADHD. And at that point, things started to click. And it was like, wow, I knew that I always thought differently. I knew that I could, see problems and situations in a way that other people couldn't. But I didn't know why. I knew that I struggled throughout school and I didn't know why, and that I learned differently. And so as I was training to become a special education teacher, um, I I started to learn about ADHD. I started to learn about different disabilities, and I was like, "Oh, that fits. That makes sense for me."
Hmm.
Um, and I think that really helped me to teach my students in a different way, to see them for who they are, and to get really interested about how do they learn, and what are they interested in, what are they curious about, and then kind of pairing that with their learning style and teaching them how do you harness your strengths and move into the workplace, move into spaces, knowing what your needs are and advocating for them. So yeah, so that's kind of one section. And then I pivoted a little bit, and I worked with a grassroots organization. It was a camp that served folks with intellectual disabilities. And I volunteered there for about 15 years and joined their staff. And that was more getting into advocacy in service related work. And then kind of following, I guess we'll just go on to my career path. So then I did some work abroad. I lived in Mozambique and Zambia, Botswana, Kenya, Uganda, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, and worked with local organizations of persons with disabilities there, um, supporting in different ways. And it was those experiences that really made me think about my understanding and experience in the US, and then my experiences in different countries, and starting to see things move beyond a service level into a systems level. And so I got really curious about international policy, international law related to disability, um, the CRPD, and how different laws intersect for people with disabilities. And that led me to get my master's degree, which I
Mm.
just wrapped up in June. So sorry, that was really long-winded.
Yeah,
But
congratulations on that.
hey, thank you. Thank you.
My next question is, tell me a little bit about your work as a researcher and just your work in disability inclusion as like an advocate.
Yeah, so it's I'll tell you a little bit about my research first, because that's more specific, and then I can talk a little bit more broadly. But my research has primarily been focused on gender and disability, and which I think is a really critical intersection. The when we think about mainstream movements, the gender movement has really lacked representation of disability, and the disability movement has really lacked the intersection of gender and including women with disabilities and our voices, as well as the LGBTQ plus community and disabled voices there. And so I also identifying as a queer woman, I think that intersectionality is critical. And so yeah, my focus is gender and disability. And um at the time that I was starting my research is when the conflict in Ukraine was just starting to break out. And
Hmm.
Laszlo, whenever there is a major event, whether it's armed conflict, a mass shooting in the United States, or a natural disaster, I immediately think about, okay, if it's in a school, what are those kiddos with disabilities? How are they navigating this space? You know, and so then when thinking about in Ukraine, I was hearing stories left and right of people trying to flee and evacuate and not being able to, or being abandoned by their families. And, then trying to resettle and being in a temporary shelter and not having their accommodations and meeting barrier after barrier after barrier. And so that is really what birthed my study that I did this spring, that was on gender and disability in humanitarian context, and looking at how do DPOs and OPDs effectively protect and provide access to women and girls with disabilities in those settings. And I loved that research. It really opened my eyes to the power of qualitative research specifically, especially within the disability community, where there are multiple intersecting identities and there's complexity that just cannot be illustrated in straight data points. You really need to hear stories, understand experiences, to then see how does policy need to shift. So the results of that study, I can share my report with you. It ended up in a model of normative conditions and recommendations for those organizations to effectively protect and provide access. And then one other piece of the finding that is really exciting to me is that it culminated in a composite narrative. And so it aggregates the data to find what were the common experiences of those women and creates a single story. So it's a story of a woman growing up in Syria before the civil war in 2012, and what pre-existing barriers she was experiencing before the war, living in a patriarchal society, how disability was viewed in that setting. And then kind of it follows her throughout evacuation during the conflict, fleeing to a refugee camp and over the border, into oh my gosh, Oh, into Wavel. I was gonna say I can't remember which refugee camp she was into
Hmm.
the Wavel refugee camp. And then her return. And so I get really excited about this and I could talk about it all day. But I think that what the composite narrative does is it takes academic methods but brings to life those experiences so that when we try to go to policymakers and and advocate for rights and legislation and changing at an international level, we're armed with something that's really practical. So you compare that the data and the kind of scholarly side with the practical implications that are presented in a way that is digestible for non-academic folks.
Hmm. My next question is, how do you make things more inclusive for people with disabilities? What sorts of methods,
Mm,
processes, stakeholders even do you use to make that happen?
That's a great question. Um, and I wish that I could say that I have a clear cut process or method. But I think what I have found to be most effective and impactful is bringing a lens of inclusion and access to every conversation, every interaction, everything that I do. And so whether that is in the workplace or that's being on a board or that is in my own home life, I think the way that I am able to make things more inclusive for people with disabilities is to raise awareness and share my own journey and my own story. To say in any opportunity that I have, to say disability is a natural part of human existence. It is a part of all of us. We will all experience having a disability at some point in our lives if we have not already. So it's not something that can be separated. It's not something that is particular to a certain identity. It cross-cuts all demographics, all sexual orientation, faith traditions, socioeconomic status, to help people understand that disability is a part of us. It's a part of and we have to become more aware of that. I think our lack of awareness has led to many of the barriers and the systemic injustices that we have experienced. And that now folks are kind of waking up to and being like, man, we got to dismantle that. It's not about the individual with a disability. It's about society and the barriers that have been put in place. Um, so I think it's that lens, and it's having super open conversations and engaging people in it and doing exactly what you're doing of saying there are these issues, let's get them out there, let's talk about them and wrestle with them. And disability is not a bad word, let's say it. And let's bring people along through education and awareness, so that there is a comfort level in talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I agree completely. Um, Tell me a little bit about the impact that your work has on the disability community.
Mhm. So I think in education, it's super important for teachers, not just special education teachers, but general education teachers, all teachers, to work really hard to create inclusive spaces for their students. So the impact of my work in education was through advocacy. It was through encouraging us to think about a universal design of learning in our classrooms, full inclusion and participation of students with disabilities, and in seeing those accommodations as a human right to access, not something that is a special request. We're not doing a favor by offering an accommodation, but that is a person's right in order to access something. Um, throughout throughout my nonprofit work, I would say, the impact there, a lot of that was through training. I did a ton of training of volunteers that focused on disability justice. And I think the biggest impact there was recognizing while that training was specific to a camp environment, it's the ripple effect. So it's, what are you learning here that now you're taking out into the world with you? How is it shifting your lens to see things differently? To recognize when you see a barrier, to say something to make that change, that it is not just on the disability community to advocate, but it's on all of us to become more aware of those barriers and to help break them down.
Hmm. My last question is, what lessons can people, companies, and others take away from this? How can they, build an inclusive space for people with disabilities?
Mm. So I think with this question, certainly there are tangible ways to make spaces more inclusive. Um, but I tend to stray away from that because I think sometimes when we have an accessibility audit or a checklist, that's what it is. It remains a checklist for someone with a disability rather than pausing and stepping back and getting curious and involving folks with disabilities to say, you, if they're not at a table, we're weaker because we don't have someone with a disability at this table. That voice is necessary and needed in order for us to be stronger, as a team, as a community. So I think my recommendation would be to seek out those voices, seek out disabled voices, amplify those voices. If you get in touch with advocates and activists, like, we are all around you and we are just looking for the chance to share. We want to help. We want to expand awareness. So just ask, and recognize when there are gaps, and that there is a gap if you do not have a disabled voice at your table. Um, and to be open to seeing new perspectives, recognizing that we're all just human, right?
Hmm.
We and that's the beauty of it. That's the strength of it, is that we are all different. We think differently. We do things differently, and yeah, and to see that as beauty and strength and interdependency is what holds us all together. So that's more of like a macro perspective, and can sound a little hokey sometimes, of we are all one, but we are.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Mhm. Did that answer